They are literally trying to promote a civil war. That's not the accidental result, that's the goal.
Right now, we see Europe in a state of war. There is talk of rearmament of the West, an ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, of course. Are these conditions that are conducive to the rise of something like communism again?
This is the part of the book that has probably got a bit of attention, maybe riled a few people up.
Hello, I'm Daniel McCarthy, Vice President for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And today we're talking about the winner of the Conservative Book of the Year Award for 2025. And that winner is To Overthrow the World by Professor Sean McMeekin. And Professor McMeekin is here to join us today to discuss his book. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's a great honor, Dan.
So maybe we should start at the end of the book. Okay. You have an assertion at the conclusion, which I know has shocked some readers. You say that communism, in some ways, is just getting started. And the final chapter of the book really lays out the ways in which the COVID lockdowns, the growth of the surveillance state within the West as a whole, how these things are following precedents set by communist China and other communist states. Can you tell us a bit about the state of communism today and why it's something that should still concern Americans in the 21st century?
Well, thanks, Dan. I think you're right. I mean, this is the part of the book that has probably got a bit of attention, maybe riled a few people up. In part because most of us, well, not everyone, but most of us, who are reasonably well-read in history have come to see that most of the communist regimes of the 20th century were economic failures, oppressed their people, committed all kinds of human rights abuses, violations, obviously piled up huge death counts and so forth. But generally speaking, though, I think most people, until pretty recently, thought that it was a bit of goodbye to all that. Thank goodness that's over. I think that was the tone, really, of a lot of the early books that came out in the post-Cold War years, whether about Soviet history or about communism, writing its obituary, as I think Richard Pipes put it in his own short history of communism, which came out about a quarter century ago. It really did seem like communism was finished. There was even, famously, there was a trial of sorts of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And Richard Pipes, who was both a historian at Harvard and also an advisor to the first term of the first Reagan administration, who actually had a role in formulating policy vis-a-vis Poland and the Solidarity movement. He was actually called as an expert witness in this trial. And I talk about it in the book in part because I think it was an important moment, but not necessarily for the reasons people thought at the time. People thought it might be something of a Nuremberg for communism, but in fact, it was a bit of a misconception. In fact, what had happened was that Yeltsin, after he came to power as president and tried to ban and tried to outlaw the Communist Party in Russia, was sued by the Communist Party, and the part most people don't realize is that the Communist Party won. So they didn't just win renewed legal status and their capacity to contest and fight elections, and they became at times either the largest or usually second largest political party in Russia. To this day, of course, very influential political party. But to some extent, they also, I think, won back a little bit of their diminished luster or prestige. So I think that's the first part of it, is that the story didn't quite end as neatly as we maybe thought it did in either 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall or 91 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think the other way in which I'm talking about this is communism is something that hasn't quite vanished, that isn't maybe finished with us yet. I suppose there I might be almost channeling the Trotsky line. You think war isn't interested in you. You may not be interested in war. War is interested in you. And you might say the same thing about communism. I suppose what I'm getting at there is that while a lot of, to borrow a term from Marx, maybe the superstructure of communism, the central planning of the economy, the full state control and ownership of the means of production, a lot of this has been jettisoned, at least by, I think, the more clever, the more ambitious, the more successful communist regimes in China with this kind of hybrid system they have now. The part they haven't abandoned in China, the part that concerns me because of it's creeping into a lot of Western social and even political life, particularly over the past decade or so, are the subtler forms of social control, whether you're talking about a social credit system. It's subtler now. Let's say in communist days in the Soviet Union or in the Eastern Bloc countries or in China, you obviously had this very rigid party structure, party membership. To get ahead, you obviously had to be on good terms with or formally a party member. So they had a social credit system, but it was a little more explicit. It was a little more blunt and in your face. Now you have varieties of censorship and social control, varieties of not always repression exactly, but certainly of surveillance and monitoring, the constant hectoring and surveilling of the population that you saw in communist regimes. It's a bit subtler now, but in some ways I think it's more insidious. And in many Western countries, we've become almost accustomed to it. COVID was just the most obvious manifestation of that. And perhaps we could talk about that in more detail, but I feel like I've already answered your question at some length.
No, that's wonderful. And one of the powerful things that comes through in your book is that while there is this romantic ideal of equality, which goes back, well before Karl Marx to, even to ancient Greek times, that the combination of that dream of equality with the practice of extreme statism is what dramatically sort of defines communism. And it's very interesting to read, in the early history of socialists and egalitarians who were uncomfortable with that statism, and of course who lose out to Karl Marx. One of the things that you point out, I think quite rightly, and again, it's an aspect that tends to get overlooked, is the importance of war in creating the conditions that allow communist regimes to take power. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, sure. I mean, I could start in both cases, whether you're talking about some of those early critics of statism or the role of war in the development of communism and the advent of communist regimes. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 is a great example, in part because it was such a seminal moment in the career and the history of Karl Marx himself, and also the communist movement, the organization Marx founded called the First Working Man's International Association. It was actually in the course of both Marx's response to the events of the war and then also the political aftermath of it that a lot of, I think, the essential ingredients, you might say, were worked out on the fly. One of which was simply that even though the Paris Commune, which was formed in kind of the wake of the war when the French armies were routed by Prussians, so the French government was discredited, its prestige was shattered, this eventually leads both Marx and later Lenin to develop this idea. Lenin would call it a bit more explicitly revolutionary defeatism. Basically, you want a kind of reactionary or obnoxious government to fight a war and to lose a war, because then the communists can seize power in the aftermath, perhaps in the ruins or perhaps in the course of, as Lenin would later put it, a civil war. And the Civil War, the term was actually used by Marx in his commentary about the Paris Commune in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, the Civil War, Bürgerkrieg in Frankreich, Civil War in France. A lot of people thought that Marx should have tried to distance himself from the Commune because it wasn't orthodox communist. It didn't fulfill all of the programmatic bullet points, you might call them, from the Communist Manifesto: state ownership of the means of production, nationalization of agriculture, industrial armies in the countryside, state control of credit in the form of the state takeover of the banks. It wasn't all there necessarily, but it was certainly radical. And Marx was even blamed for it by a lot of people in the press. And so a lot of people around Marx's inner circle thought he should distance himself from it, say, no, this isn't really communism. That's what we're always hearing kind of Marxists and communists say, is like, well, real communism wasn't tried. That wasn't what Marx said. He said, absolutely. They did their best, but most of all, they were revolutionaries. They were moving history forward, and they basically went down into blaze of violence. And that, too, was part of their authenticity, because they were willing to shed blood to create this new utopian state. Even if they failed, they were setting an example. Now, there were a lot of people who shied away from this. Marx had a lot of critics in the movement who began to distance themselves from him because they thought he was maybe a little too violent. He also had a really interesting feud with this Russian anarchist called Mikhail Bakunin, about the Paris Commune, but also about tactics. And what Bakunin saw both from Marx's writings, but also from his actions as a political actor, he saw where this was going. That yes, you might have some doctrinal disputes over policy, over macroeconomics, over the state ownership of the means of production, but basically if you wanted any type of command economy, any type of forcible overthrow of inequality, forcible overthrow of private property, it would require not just violence, but an extremely strong centralized state. So his critique of this was actually called statism and anarchy. So it's interesting, but those two elements, both statism and also the role of war and violence, Marx himself, unlike a lot of his, I think, less imaginative or perhaps more dogmatic followers who maybe don't read the doctrines or even really the writings very closely, he was quite clear that they were necessary. Statism was necessary. Maybe the paradox, and I suppose Marx's defenders will always say, well, he said the state would wither away eventually, and maybe he implied this. He never really said straight out what's going to happen. Eventually, I guess the idea is that the state withers away. But in the meantime, as Bakunin sensed, perhaps coming from the left, he sensed this even sooner than some people on the right, he knew where this was going. You were going to get a more powerful state, a more oppressive state, a more tyrannical state than any that had ever been seen before on the planet.
Tyranny is also one of the great themes of To Overthrow the World. And it's very interesting. You present a rather darker view of the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall than Westerners are accustomed to hearing. Westerners think of this as the end of history. It's the triumph of, oppressed masses taking to the streets to overthrow their oppressors and wanting to adopt a Western way of life. And you say that, in fact, a large part of the story, perhaps the critical part of it, is simply the failure of will and the inability or unwillingness of the communist rulers of the Soviet Union and its satellite states to use violence as they had previously. And you point out that all communist regimes have come to power through violence, not through the ballot box. And so tell us a bit about this, how the Cold War really ended and how the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc really came to this change, that it wasn't in fact this kind of Hegelian end of history or Fukuyama-style end of history, but was a story about violence and perhaps the inability of a ruling elite to continue using the violence that had propped it up all along.
Well, right. Certainly for a lot of the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, that for them it was not just the overthrow of communism, but to some extent the overthrow of the imperial domination of the Soviet Union is a mostly positive story that they would see in retrospect, even though there were certain elements of it that were dark. But at the center of it all, of course, is the role of Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership. And I think the thing a lot of people misunderstand about Gorbachev, and some of this is because of our later image of him as Time magazine's Man of the Decade, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, that this is a man who supposedly was this kind of visionary, maybe a social democrat or a communism with a human face who voluntarily dismantled the system. Well, he did dismantle the system, but it wasn't his intention to do so. And it wasn't just that when he first came to power, the Cold War was in some ways not at its height necessarily. It wasn't quite as tense as perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was awfully tense. The early 1980s, Reagan's first term, when Reagan made his famous Evil Empire speech, the SDI buildup, there were stare-downs and showdowns. There were episodes such as even the Soviet shooting down of a passenger airline, a Korean passenger airline. There weren't really any proper summits in Reagan's first term. Things were extremely tense. And when Gorbachev first came to power, he was not trying to dismantle the Soviet system. He was actually trying to basically step up and match Reagan's arms buildup, both conventional and also maybe to some extent strategic. And the really curious part about the story that not a lot of people know is that at least in hard power terms, the arms buildup actually succeeded. When you think about perestroika, now we kind of think, oh, you have these cheering crowds and glasnost and openness and maybe the opening up of the veil of censorship, and there's a bit more discussion of the crimes of Stalin and all this. But in fact, the key word, the watchword, and it was actually the 12th Soviet 5-year plan, was uskorenie, acceleration. They were actually trying to ramp up. It was basically a massive arms buildup. And in a lot of hard power categories, if you're talking about things like tanks and mobile air artillery and nuclear submarines and actual artillery, the Soviets were actually outbuilding the Americans substantially, significantly. In a curious way, in that kind of very raw, hard material sense, the Soviets were either winning the Cold War, they certainly weren't losing it. The trouble is this actually bankrupted the Soviet economy. And even that didn't necessarily lead to the collapse, because Gorbachev in the end was just, and this is, I think, we have to understand, if you spend a lot of time in Russia, you realize just how badly Gorbachev is resented and despised. Obviously by someone like Putin, who's something of a revanchist, but also just by most Russian kind of nationalist patriots, or even really ordinary mainstream Russians, because they see him as someone who kind of dismantled the empire in some sense inadvertently, but out of incompetence. It got to the point where by 1990, he was so desperate for Western approval and loans, maybe because he fell in love with his image in the West. There was a lot of favorable press coverage. I think it's always a temptation for any leader when they're increasingly resented or despised at home, but they're kind of worshipped abroad. Gorbachev had this adoring audience wherever he went in the West. But he got so desperate that at one point, he's basically begging West Germany for Deutschmarks, effectively to withdraw the Soviet troops, nearly 400,000 from East Germany, which is just sort of a garrison state at that point. And in 1990, he actually began to beg the first President Bush, George Bush the Elder, as the Russians call him. They have this funny terminology for it. He was asking President Bush effectively to surrender the Cold War in exchange for money. He literally was begging for dollars, in part part because, again, of the arms buildup, in part because of the inflation that was rampaging through the Soviet economy. And the other thing is he wasn't a pacifist. He shed blood on numerous occasions. What really kind of happened in the last couple of years was a combination of his desperation and I think diplomatic and strategic ineptitude, along with the fact that he began alienating the Soviet officer corps. The very men who were carrying out his orders in places like Almaty and Baku and Riga, and then probably a bit more press happened when there was a crackdown in Vilnius because there were a few more Western reporters present. He kind of he hung them out to dry, basically. He criticized them in public even though they were carrying out his own orders because he didn't like what they were doing to his image in the West. So he really alienated the Soviet officer corps. The analogy I use in the book, and you have to go back to 1917 to understand this, but right before the communists came to power, Kerensky, the last leader of kind of pre-communist, the provisional government in Russia, he had this affair he crossed swords, usually called the Kornilov affair. And the way he played it, or misplayed it, he ended up alienating really almost the entire upper ranks of the old Tsarist Russian officer corps. So they didn't fight for him when the Bolsheviks tried to kind of come to power. And so something like that happened in 1991, in the days before, during, and maybe after the coup. No one in the Soviet military really wanted to fight for what remained of the government. Gorbachev's own role in the coup is a bit more ambiguous, but that is, they certainly weren't going to fight for his government and his system. And almost all the coup plotters were Gorbachev's appointees. And so the men did not want to fight for them. Whatever they thought of Gorbachev, in the end, famously, of course, they kind of turned the tanks around. Yeltsin wins the showdown. So Gorbachev really was incompetent in a lot of ways, and we in the West perhaps can be thankful for that. But we should understand that for a lot of Russians, he's still seen as someone who was deeply unsuccessful at best and wholly inept at worst. And that's part of the reason why I think we've had such trouble in our relations with Russia the years since, is that the Russians felt like the US and the West and NATO were taking advantage of them at this moment of weakness, which to some extent we were.
The comparison of Kerensky to Gorbachev is quite striking, as is the somewhat book-ended rise of communism with World War I and also World War II, as you point out. And perhaps we'll talk in a few minutes about the role of Joseph Stalin in promoting the Second World War and expanding it. But also that the Soviet Union ends with a war as well, with the Afghanistan conflict, where, of course, the Soviet Union becomes heavily invested and winds up, basically not having the kind of success that would be necessary in order to, keep them going. Although, as you point out in the book, many of the battles, many of the engagements were actually quite successful for the Soviets. But again, this rift between the civilian command and the generals was perhaps growing at that point. So say a few things about, or tell us a bit about this, kind of curious parallel where communist power rises in the first place through these, world wars, that it ends, perhaps with the Afghanistan war, or at least that's a contributing factor. And what does this mean for China and the perhaps conflicts that China might provoke or get involved in the near future?
Well, so if we were to go back to Lenin, I talked about how Lenin had learned from Marx and also from his own reading of history, this pattern which seemed to be, it was very striking. So you had after the Franco-Prussian War, France loses, so France has a revolution. It happened in Russia in 1904-1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan basically humiliated Russia, somewhat to everyone's surprise, in this war, first with a sneak attack and then just really badly beating the Russians in the field and particularly at sea. Russia had another revolution, which nearly, but did not quite topple the Tsarist regime. By the time of the First World War, Lenin had really worked this into a doctrine, and so he called it revolutionary defeatism. And effectively what it meant was that communists should seek the defeat of their own, and he actually used reverse quote marks, effectively their own country. So basically you want your country to lose, and to some extent you're also going to promote that, you're going to bring it about. So the striking phrase, and it was actually a slogan that he promoted, was called "Turn the imperialist war into civil war." So the First World War is an imperialist war, you want it to be transformed into a civil war. There were other Marxist, socialist, people can argue about who was the better or more orthodox Marxist. My own view is that Lenin was updating, but was still kind of true to the tradition. There were some who recoiled from war and violence, or they certainly didn't want to exacerbate them. But from a Marxist perspective, and this is true even in the lyrics of the Internationale by Eugène Patier, that's basically about a mutiny. Basically, you have the soldiers, the kings, intoxicate us with gun smoke. They'll know soon enough that our bullets are for our own generals. Effectively, it's a kind of a promotion of mutiny on a massive scale. And that's what Lenin proceeded to do. He didn't just do it, he even wrote about it. One of his lesser known, but I think more important works. It was called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution. It's even right there in the title. He was reading Clausewitz during the war. So he's thinking war, he's kind of breathing war, and to him, politics is war. Clausewitz had famously said that war was the continuation of politics. This is a slight mistranslation of the German, politics by other means. Lenin basically saw politics as war. He brought war to politics. So it's all about basically who has more men under arms. And what's amazing is you can see very common even phraseology. There's a famous Stalin quote about the Pope and how many divisions does the Pope have, or maybe it was how many guns. I can't remember the phrase. The idea is they're actually very, very blunt and upfront about the fact that to them politics is sublimated warfare, not even so sublimated. And Lenin, right before they take power in the October Revolution, November by our calendar, they were literally counting up and trying to figure out, do we have more men under arms? Do they have more money? How many men can Kerensky count on? How many Red Guards have we recruited from some of them from the factories, most of them from armed units? I think that's the other thing people don't necessarily understand about the Russian Revolution the Revolution of 1917. Not just the Bolshevik one, but even the earlier one. Effectively, the February Revolution was a mutiny in the Petrograd garrison. The October Revolution was not a mutiny in quite the same sense. Rather, the Bolsheviks had by then spent about 6 or 7 months propagandizing the armies. With anti-war propaganda, down with the war, all power to the Soviets, but basically end the imperialist war. And they were even quite explicit about their aim, which was to demobilize the imperialist army, but ensure that the men would leave the army with their guns. You can actually see it right there in the documents. So they are literally trying to promote a civil war. That's not the accidental result. That's the goal. And so you'll see this again and again in the various countries in which communism would later emerge. It almost always emerges either in the wake of a devastating interstate conflict or a civil war, or usually a little bit of both. So in the case of China, you had a war with Japan going back in some form all the way to 1931. The more proper Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937. And then after that war ends in 1945, it becomes a civil war. You have the same thing in Yugoslavia, where there was a war first against the Germans, Bulgarians, occupiers. Eventually, it turns into a civil war, which Tito wins. So that even in the cases where supposedly, a lot of people always view Tito and Mao as kind of exceptions to this rule. They weren't just Soviet stooges. They were kind of their own men. They created revolution on their own terms. Not entirely true, both because they had foreign sponsorship, but also because they were kind of following out the Lenin model, which is to say, turning some variety of what communists, again, in their sort of phraseology, they would call it an imperialist war, meaning a war between imperialist capitalist regimes, which then becomes a civil war. So Stalin, in some ways, was the most successful of all of them, but he was successful in promoting and exacerbating war, so that he would help to promote and exacerbate these wars in Asia between China and Japan, make sure the communists were biding their time, waiting until basically the two sides had exhausted themselves. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists had exhausted the Japanese, and then once the Japanese were beaten, the Soviets helped Mao come in and basically capture a bunch of arms, helped to arm Mao for the Civil War, helped to promote the Civil War. Same thing in Yugoslavia. There's a bit of a checkered past where the British, I think in a kind of an own goal, they actually ended up backing Tito over their own loyal, basically the Chetniks who were pro-British, who were fighting on behalf of the Royal Yugoslav government in exile in London. Sometimes they get these lucky breaks. Some of it may be because they would have Soviet agents, but all along the basic template is still pretty clear. You have to have war. The war, whether you call it imperialist or interstate war, will eventually lead to civil wars. And what's amazing is, again, Lenin drew this all out. In this is the military program of the Proletarian Revolution, which he publishes in 1916. He says this is what will happen. Imperialist war will lead to civil war, and then the communist country will be in a state of war, whether declared or undeclared, with the imperialist world, and this will eventually lead to wars between them, and eventually you'll get civil wars engulfing the earth. And he wasn't saying, I hope this doesn't happen. He was saying, I hope this happens. He's advocating for it.
Do the communists lose their aptitude for war by the time of the end of the Soviet Union and the Afghanistan war? Is it that the mechanism that had brought them to power is now working against them? Or is there something else going on there?
Well, I suppose a bit of both. There is something else going on, which is that there's a lot of pushback, and that's coming from the United States and its allies, particularly in Afghanistan, with the U.S. getting arms and eventually, famously, the Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen and doing a lot to dent Soviet military prestige. So by the late 1980s, you have both Gorbachev pushing this domestic arms buildup, which I talked about, along with the war in Afghanistan, which is going sour, in part because the U.S. is, of course, supporting the Mujahideen, the various factions fighting the Soviets there. You also had, by then, the Soviets are, of course, supporting this massive overseas empire of client states. Even small clients like Cuba are draining the treasury to maybe $5 billion a year. I do think that to some extent Soviet military effectiveness had declined, but I also think it maybe was never quite as great as people thought to begin with. There were certainly times when the Soviets were formidable. 1944-45 is obviously one of them when they're marching on Nazi Germany, but some of my own research has pointed out how much of the logistics and particularly the war materiel on which the Soviets depended in the Second World War was actually coming from the United States and its allies via Lend-Lease. So while the Soviets weren't by any means a weakling and their arsenal was quite real, and by the early 70s they'd achieved even a parity in terms of nuclear striking power, ICBMs, and so on and so forth, the economy, the war economy, the problem was they had to spend a massive amount on the military compared to the size of the economy. That's what in the end bankrupted them. They're trying to compete with the Americans on the American terms, but the U.S. is just a much richer country. The U.S. and its analysts, particularly the CIA, didn't always, I think, understand or appreciate this. Quite famously, throughout the 1960s and 70s, they were consistently overestimating Soviet economic performance and potential. So in the end, I think it's a failure of the war economy more than it is specifically of Soviet arms. But just to give one example of why I think they got it wrong, it's a famous example of that old saw about statistics. You know, you have lies, and you have a certain kind of lies, drastic, we'll call them lies, drastic lies, and then there are statistics. The CIA and a lot of its analysts were depending on the official market exchange rate, which had the dollar is actually being less valuable than the ruble. So the ruble was supposed to be maybe about $1.20, whereas on the black market, it was really more like 10 rubles to the dollar. So they're off by a factor of 12. And so the Soviet economy is either 60% the size of the US economy and growing, which is what they often thought, or they had it somewhere in that range, or it's more like 5% the size of the US economy. That is about a 20th the size of the US economy. So if the Soviet economy was a 20th the size of the Soviet economy, of the US economy, but they're actually spending nearly as much as the US on arms, on armor, on the military, on missiles and so forth, then they're going to bankrupt themselves very quickly. You know, so that in the end, you might say the strategic logic of the Reagan arms buildup, assuming this was the logic, it actually did have a kind of an impact, a very significant impact in the end on the Soviet position. I think it was more about war economy than it was about arms as such. Because the Soviets, they weren't exactly losing in Afghanistan. It's just their losses became harder and harder to take. The expenses became harder and harder to take. And in the end, it obviously dented the prestige of the regime at a time when they're starting to have domestic troubles, at a time when Gorbachev is starting to worry about his image, and at a time when really he's desperate for funds. You just had rampaging inflation by 89, 90, 91. And to some extent, you also had what you might call a kind of elites jumping the ship. That is to say, we might call them rats. Maybe that's not the nicest word, but that is members of the secret police, members of the party, eventually saw that the system was failing, and so they started secreting a lot of the funds away into foreign bank accounts, and that just ratcheted up. It was kind of a snowball effect. You know, by early 91, by late 91, the Soviets they literally are running out of money. I mean, the gold reserves are pretty much run dry. I mean, one of the interesting questions that we can maybe come back to is, you know, had the Soviets had some of the tools that regimes might have had 20 or 30 years later, that is to say, if they hadn't had to spend quite so much on the KGB and the military, had they had social media at their disposal, a lot of other tools of surveillance and repression, they may not have bankrupted themselves trying to compete with the Americans. But in the end, it was effectively a failure of Soviet war economy.
So we have only scratched the surface. This book, To Overthrow the World, is an absolutely brilliant single volume covering everything from the prehistory of communism before Marx all the way through to the fall of the Soviet Union, and then of course with a provocative conclusion saying that we should not rest easy now about the end of communism. And perhaps just to close things out, we can come back to this question that you just raised. So is it the case that the idealistic side of communism, this egalitarianism, is now dead? Is it gone? Is it no longer something that is going to inspire the masses, if it ever did, either here in the West or anywhere? Is that the case? However, we have the military and the coercive apparatus of police states and also of the new social media coercion and surveillance. Is that the future of communism, or will this more idealistic side of communism that sort of duped a lot of Westerners into following this statism that otherwise they might have been alarmed by? Will this idealistic side and its sort of potential to bamboozle people will it also revive?
Well, I think a lot does depend on evolving circumstances. I suppose this is maybe not the most direct way of answering, but if you look at a lot of countries in Western Europe today, I think you do have to focus on the social media controls, the censorship, and those aspects of communism that I talk about in the book, that those are ever ready and very present problems, whether you're talking about Romanian presidential candidates being knocked off the ballot, people being arrested for social media posts, certain subjects or discussions being ruled out of bounds in a country like Germany. In Europe, that's what I would probably be worried about. Now, not that we don't have those concerns in the United States, but I think we do have something which has emerged even really since I wrote the book, but in some ways it goes back to an earlier era of both communism and anarchism, which I do talk about in the late 19th century. Again, history can take very, very strange twists and turns, and we may be returning to an age when, while it looked like the rise of identity politics and intersectionality in at least United States kind of political landscape and social politics was taking things in a direction away from what you might call the more traditional class approach to either socialism, communism, social critique. We seem to be getting back to an era almost of social protests against the rich. That is to say, with some of these symbolic acts of violence, the assassination of the healthcare CEO. Now we have, I suppose, arson against Teslas for some reason to do with it's part politics and perhaps part protest against capitalism. People are starting to talk about capitalism again today. Some of this language is actually quite traditional and quite familiar. I'm sure it will take unpredictable forms, but I don't think that this strain in our politics is ever completely going to go away, because we will always have inequality and we will always have idealistic people, many of whom I think, perhaps not being very well read in the history, are tempted down these socially destructive paths. Again, not peaceful protest, but violent protest. Not, let's say, even a symbolic picketing of some hated capitalist figure with a top hat who's out of a Marxist caricature, but actual direct physical assault or assassination attempts. We may see more and more of that, I think, in the West. But we do have to keep our eye on China, not least because of what happened with the COVID controls. I think the social credit system that has emerged there, which in many ways has begun to spread through the West, is something we definitely need to keep our eyes on. I think for the moment, maybe it's not necessarily at the forefront of our concerns here, but I think it's something that is increasingly present in Europe, and I think it's something that we definitely have to watch out for.
So perhaps a bonus question as well. Now, you are a historian, not a prophet, but right now we see Europe in a state of war. There is talk of rearmament of the West. There is an ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, of course. Is this creating conditions which have the potential to spark a new kind of, perhaps not a replay exactly of what we saw in either of the world wars, but are these conditions that are conducive to the rise of something like communism again?
Well, I think we were in grave danger the past several years of the war in Ukraine metastasizing and perhaps leading to a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, not simply a proxy war, but maybe even with certain targeting systems and missiles being launched into Russia and the possibility of Russian retaliation, which, of course, at times President Putin actually talked openly about. That is to say, where are the red lines in our own version of this kind of DEFCON system? We may have been in grave danger. I certainly have some hope that the war in Ukraine may wind down, that some type of a ceasefire, we seem to be right in the process now of an ongoing ceasefire negotiation. I'm guardedly optimistic, not necessarily that the war is going to end in the next few days or even a few weeks, but that at some point an end to this war can be negotiated. I'm a little less concerned about the mobilization of both money for the military in Europe and these kind of threats that you get coming out of the European capitals. I just don't think most of the countries in Europe really have either the stomach or the willpower for war. First of all, they're going to have to find soldiers. A country like Britain, its army is just it's a fraction of the size of what it was even 20 years ago. France and Poland have slightly larger militaries, as does Turkey, as far as you're talking about kind of the members of the NATO alliance. And perhaps you might more realistically see a scenario where they at least have the manpower they could consider fighting a war, perhaps deploying troops abroad. I think China is definitely a more ever-present threat, strategically speaking, I think both to United States interests and perhaps to the danger of a war breaking out in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, perhaps over Taiwan, perhaps over some issue involving the Philippines. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't necessarily predict. That would concern me, because there you obviously have the two heavyweights of geopolitics, the United States and China, that are already strategic adversaries. I have some hope that diplomacy can prevail, that in the end we will not get a confrontation that is going to spiral out of control, whether between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine or between the U.S. and China over the Taiwan Strait. And part of the reason that I'm, I suppose, guardedly optimistic is because I think any such conflict is going to go somewhere that we will not be comfortable or happy with, and we will basically have to suffer horrors that we can barely imagine today. And that's when, yes, the more extreme varieties of political ideology, such as communism, tend to flourish. So perhaps, knock on wood, with guarded optimism, I hope that some form of diplomacy can prevail, and that confrontation need not necessarily lead to armed conflict between the great powers.
Well, guarded optimism is a great note on which to end, with an emphasis on guarded. And Professor McMeekin's book, To Overthrow the World, is an important inoculation and a vaccine, in a sense, against complacency and against falling back into the habits either of a kind of detached idealism or a complacency towards statism and towards war, which have led to the rise of communism in the past and which we should not rule out as being a danger in the future. So thank you very much.